So for now, we should move on to the talk of Dr. Tatsuya Amano, who's a future fellow at the University of Queensland in the School of Biology, I believe. School of Biological Sciences, I think they call it. His talk is continuing the theme of the last talk. I think you'll agree in that its title is non-English literature important in science?
Great, thanks very much. Can you hear me and can you see my screen? Great, so thanks very much, Sandy, for a very interesting and also very relevant talk to my talk as well. And also thanks so much for inviting me to this exciting conference and also for giving me an opportunity to talk about our research and our project. So my name is Tatsuya Amano and currently based at the University of Queensland, funded by the ARC Future Fellowship. And my research has been focusing on understanding the status of global biodiversity and its effective conservation. But through my past work, I have become very interested in the role of non-English language literature and science in today's scientific activities. So today I'm quite excited to be talking about our project, and one of the key questions our project has been trying to answer whether non-English language literature is important in science. Okay, so is it important in science? So first of all, let's look at how non-English language literature is being used in today's scientific activities. For example, in the assessment conducted by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, over 90% of the references cited are in English, unsurprisingly. And similarly, over 80% of the Campbell Collaboration Systematic Reviews only include English language studies. So it seems clear to me that most people now do not necessarily recognize non-English language literature as important source of scientific information. But is it really not important? That is what our project called Translate Project has been trying to answer in a scientific way. But actually, I already know the answer. The answer is yes, because I certainly have published some of my key papers in Japanese. And I'm sure Shinichi, I'm not sure if he's here, but I'm sure Shinichi would also agree because I know he has also published, for example, this paper in Japanese. But of course, many of you may not be convinced that these papers are actually important to science. So I guess I need to provide some more convincing evidence to prove my point that non-English language literature is indeed important for scientific communities. So, as I said, answering this question is one of the primary goals of our project called the Translate Project. But this is actually only one aspect of our project, which is trying to understand consequences of language barriers in science more broadly. So if you're interested, please visit our website to find out more. But anyway, I think the current underuse of non-English language literature in scientific communities is probably based on the following three common assumptions. The first assumption is that most scientific knowledge must be available in English because English is now the common language of science. The second assumption is that as science has increasingly become globalized, more and more non-native English speakers are certainly publishing papers and their work in English, so non-English language literature must be now diminishing. And finally, even if a fair amount of non-English language literature does exist, some people might assume that English language science effectively represent a random subset of information published in non-English language science, in which case non-English language literature might safely be ignored. But actually, these three points are rather intuitive assumptions, which are not necessarily based on actual scientific evidence. So our project has been trying to test these three assumptions in a scientific way. Okay, so first of all, is most scientific knowledge actually available in English? So to answer this question, we decided to investigate the amount of scientific knowledge published in different languages based on Google Scholar searches. Luckily, Google Scholar has allowed us to search scientific documents with non-English keywords and also restrict searches to websites written in a particular language for many languages. So we simply searched scientific documents with these two keywords, biodiversity and conservation, in 16 major languages. And the result was that about 64% of the scientific documents published in 2014 was in English, unsurprisingly. And 12% was in Spanish, 10% was in Portuguese, 6% was in simplified Chinese, 3% was in French, and here are all the other languages. So in sum, about 36% of scientific documents published in 2014 about biodiversity and conservation was in non-English languages. So whether you see this figure as high or low probably vary among people, but this simply means that by ignoring non-English language literature, we may lose up to 36% of the globally accumulated knowledge, which is not a small proportion, I believe. So we can at least say that this assumption, most scientific knowledge is available in English, is not necessarily supported by evidence. We have also been looking for non-English language academic journals in the research areas of ecology and conservation, and have already identified 466 peer-reviewed journals in 19 languages, some of which are surprisingly publishing papers from the 19th century. And the list of these journals is available on our website. So this again indicates that the non-negligible amount of scientific knowledge is still published in non-English languages too. Again, the second common assumption we are testing here is whether non-English language literature is diminishing or not. Here, Sean Chaudhry, a PhD student at UQ, is reading this part. And for this, we adopted the same approach as we did for the first assumption and used the Google Scholar to investigate how the amount of non-English language literature searched with these two keywords in 16 different languages has been changing over time. And for this, we use not only Google Scholar, but also Scopus, Web of Science, and some domestic literature databases for 12 languages. And we have obtained these results. Here we only showed results based on Google Scholar, shown in green, and based on domestic databases in pink. And here, English language literature on biodiversity conservation, shown on this panel, has been increasing. And there's a slight decrease in recent years, surprisingly. So this might be due to the time lag between publications and identifications on Google Scholar, but we are still not sure. And when we look at other languages, the amount of non-English language literature has also been increasing in most languages, but particularly in Portuguese, Spanish, simplified Chinese, and Russian. And only French and German showed a declining trend when based on the local language databases. But these patterns are very different from patterns based on Google Scholar, shown in green here. So I think we still need to double check these results for these two languages. And this figure shows the annual growth rate of scientific documents published in different languages based on different databases. And as you can see, the amount of non-English language literature is certainly increasing in most languages and at a similar rate to English language literature. And these results showing low and even negative growth rate are often based on Scopus, which does not necessarily index many non-English language journals. So we don't think these results are not necessarily very reliable. So again, this indicates that the second assumption that non-English language literature is diminishing is not necessarily supported by evidence. And I will talk about this in more detail later, but we have also been trying to identify non-English language literature that meets more specific and detailed selection criteria to compile scientific evidence on the effectiveness of conservation interventions. And here's a figure showing yearly changes in the number of relevant papers in 10 languages. And as you can see, in 4 languages, Japanese, German, Simplified Chinese, and Portuguese, the number of relevant papers has actually been increasing significantly. And other 2 languages also showed a nearly significant increase, and the other 4 languages did not show any significant changes. So again, this indicates, even when based on a specific selection criteria, the relevant non-English language literature is not necessarily diminishing, but rather increasing in some languages. Okay, so finally, the third common assumption is that English language science does represent a random subset of non-English language science. And there have already been multiple attempts to test this assumption, especially in the research area of healthcare. So I guess many of you might already know this. But this famous paper showed that German language papers are more likely to publish non-significant results compared to papers written in English. And this issue is known as language bias in evidence synthesis, meaning that the direction and nature of a study's result can affect which language it is published in. But most of the earlier studies testing this language bias had largely focused on language bias in statistical results, meaning more specifically testing whether English language studies are more likely to publish more statistically significant results. But we thought that a slightly different type of language bias might also exist, especially in ecology and biodiversity conservation, which is language bias in study characteristics. For example, studies conducted at local spatial scale or on a single species might be more likely to get published in non-English language journals because those those studies are not necessarily of high interest to international audience. But if this type of language bias does exist, this is a serious issue because in this case, by ignoring non-English language literature, we may be missing really important information on local endemic species, often threatened species and ecosystems in countries where English is not widely spoken. So we tested that these 2 types of language bias using meta-analysis, including both English language and Japanese language studies. We first searched for meta-analysis that included a sufficient number of Japanese language studies, as well as English language studies. And then although most meta-analysis did not search Japanese language studies, we found 4 meta-analyses that searched and used Japanese language studies. And in 2 out of the 4 meta-analyses, the overall mean effect size differed significantly between English language and Japanese language studies. And in both cases, ignoring Japanese language studies could have led to more significant effect sizes. And we also found a clear language bias in study characteristics. For example, in this meta-analysis, most studies on birds and mammals are in English, whereas all studies on amphibians and fish are in Japanese. And in the other meta-analysis, most experimental-based studies are published in English. And there are, of course, multiple explanations for why this type of language bias in study characteristics might exist. For example, there might be the influence of local societies focusing on these specific taxa, or maybe studies on these specific taxa might be focusing on very local questions, and so more likely to be submitted to local language journals. And in this meta-analysis, however, effect size did not differ between languages within studies of the same characteristics, that is within each taxon. However, effect size differed between taxa. So this means language bias in study characteristics, especially among taxa, together with varying responses between taxa, seems to explain the revealed difference in effect size between languages. And in the other meta-analysis, effect size differed significantly between languages, even within studies of the same characteristics, such as field-based studies. So in this case, language bias in statistical result might be present, explaining the revealed difference in effect size between languages. So in sum, these results indicate that ignoring non-English language literature can change conclusions in meta-analysis drastically, at least in this research area of ecology and biodiversity conservation. And language bias seems to exist both in study characteristics and in statistical results, which seems to explain the revealed difference in effect size between languages. So given these results, I don't think we can safely argue that English language science represent a random subset of non-English language science. So this work focused only on Japanese language studies, but we have also been working on a similar comparison of information published in 16 different languages based on a global collaboration. I briefly mentioned this work earlier, but the Conservation Evidence Project has been identifying English language studies that test the effectiveness of conservation interventions based on a specific selection criteria. So our Translate project has been applying the same selection criteria to non-English language journals to identify relevant non-English language papers. And by collaborating with over 40 native speakers of different languages around the world, to date, we have identified a total of 466 peer-reviewed journals in ecology and conservation in 19 languages, and we have screened over 400,000 papers in 327 journals in 16 languages, from which we identified over 1,000 non-English language papers that meet our selection criteria, that is, providing the evidence on the effectiveness of conservation interventions. And this work is still ongoing, but I can show you some preliminary results. Here, these blue grid cells show the distribution of English language studies. And you can see English language studies are, unsurprisingly, concentrated in certain countries, such as the UK and the US. And this creates a huge gap in the availability of scientific evidence that is necessary for the conservation of biodiversity in some other regions, such as South America, Africa, most parts of Asia, and Russia. And this is of particular concern because most of these regions are actually the most biodiverse regions, so requiring desperately the scientific evidence for the conservation of biodiversity. Then you can see that we have found a number of scientific studies published in non-English languages, providing really important scientific evidence for biodiversity conservation in those regions with less information when based on English language studies. So this means if we ignore those non-English language studies, we could lose really important scientific evidence for biodiversity conservation in these most biodiversity rich, species rich regions, and quite often threatened regions. So again, this I believe this indicates that the importance of searching non-English language literature in ecology and biodiversity conservation. Okay, so in conclusion, our research showed that actually none of the three common assumptions on non-English language literature is supported by scientific evidence. Instead, we showed up to 36% of biodiversity literature could be still published in non-English languages. The amount of biodiversity literature is actually increasing in most languages at a similar rate to English. And there's a bias in both study characteristics and statistical results between English language and non-English language studies. So there are obviously still several things we need to explore, such as the difference in study quality between languages. But our research, our findings so far, at least indicates that non-English language literature still plays a non-negligible role in today's scientific activities. And ignoring those non-English language science could lead to a huge bias and misunderstanding of our knowledge on biodiversity conservation. So I believe making a better use of non-English language literature is potentially key to synthesizing the globally accumulated knowledge in an unbiased way and maximizing our scientific contribution to global challenges like the ongoing biodiversity crisis. Yep, I think that's it from me today, and thanks very much for listening. Right,
thank you, Tatsuya. We've got a number of excellent questions in the Q&A that we can get we'll get to some of them before we have our break in Gathertown. So Matthew Ling of Deakin University here in Australia has written into the Q&A to say, this is very valuable, interesting, and thoughtful work. Is there work to replicate your methods across other disciplines? I imagine there's the possibility of different trajectories in certain fields.
Yeah, I think that is a great idea. So obviously my expertise is biodiversity conservation, so I have been focusing on this in this discipline, but I'm keen to expand this research into other disciplines. So if you're interested, please do let me know. I'm happy to collaborate with anyone about this research topic.
Patrice Potier writes, fascinating work, Tatsuya. Have you considered contacting Web of Science to help reference local databases in their platform? I know that the Russian Science Citation Index and Korean, I believe, journal database are already included in their collection, but it would be very interesting to expand this.
Yeah, I'm sure that's another great idea. And yeah, as you said, the Russian, Korean, and Spanish, sorry, I can't remember the name, but the literature database in Latin America is also covered in Web of Science, and also Arabic one is also covered. So yeah, it would be really great if Web of Science could cover other language databases as well. Yeah.
And you may see that Robert Thibault is asking, is there an estimate of how many of the 36% of non-English public language publication contain an abstract in English?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and please do read my paper. I think I have provided the number, but I can't remember. But basically, the conclusion is not necessarily many papers provide English abstract and English title. So it's essentially invisible if you search in English.
And Tim Parker, who you may know as an ecologist based in the US, says, wonderful talk, Tatsuya. What, if any, obstacles do you see to better inclusion of non-English language studies and meta-analyses? It seems to me that with tools like Google Translate, it should be relatively easy to include studies from multiple languages in meta-analysis. Is finding studies published in different languages the major obstacle?
Yeah, so basically I think the understanding of the detail in each paper is definitely the major barrier. So you definitely need really, native level language skills to fully understand the whole paper. So we can definitely use machine translation to roughly search and identify papers. And the quality of machine translation might be improving in the near future. But at the moment, we definitely need human language skills to understand. And that is the real obstacle, I think.
And Hannah, who I suspect is Hannah who is the president of our society at Melbourne University, writes, related to Tim's question, do you have suggestions about how to overcome the bias towards English language literature?
So I guess what's the most important is to recognize the potential importance of non-English language literature. And then the next point is the actual platform to be able to search in different languages. So that, as I said, technology might help, but also developing collaborators with native speakers of different languages would be really effective, as our collaboration has already shown. So we have been collaborating with over 40 native speakers of different languages around the world. So developing this collaboration could be one important step forward, I think.
Dom Roche writes, thanks you for a fascinating talk. I'm curious about the metrics you plan on using to evaluate the quality of English and non-English papers.
Yeah, so that is really great point. And we have already extracted the study design in each study. So we are essentially trying to compare the proportion of different study designs and to see if there's any significant change, so a significant difference.
Bonnie Wintle says, fascinating work, Tatsuya. Following from Tim's question, is one of the obstacles to incorporating non-English studies in meta-analyses due to challenges in reliability of translating the main results effects with tools like Google Translate?
So that's a real issue. So just yesterday I used Google Translate for some other purpose, and that made a critical error saying completely different meaning. So it's not that reliable in detail, and that's why we need diversity in our scientific team. If we involve multiple linguistically diverse collaborators in our team, that can be easily solved. So